Hi gang, Scott here. Let's talk about dynamic contrast. This is my favorite filter in the effects module in ON1 Photo RAW. It touches a lot of my photos, So we'll run down the filter, the sliders, how it works, and I'll show you a few examples of how you can apply it to your photography in more than just a drop it on the photo and move on. There is quite a bit of nuance and crafting and shaping we can do with dynamic contrast. If you like videos like this, hit the subscribe button. If you're thinking about adding ON1 Photo RAW or any of the ON1 plugins to your toolkit, check the show notes. There is an offer code down there that can save you some money. Let's now dive into dynamic contrast. This photo here is a good one to show the sliders and how dynamic contrast changes a photo. There's a lot of texture in this thing. There's a lot of nuance in this. Let's do this. Let's add our dynamic contrast filter. And let's zoom in really close here so we can see all sorts of detail. And for the purposes of this demonstration, I'll add a gradient mask so we can just have a cut line and be able to see the before and after of our dynamic contrast. Matter of fact, I think I can just do that with a preview. Can I do that with the preview? And just put the line up here? Let's do that. That'll be even easier, right? We'll take the line and we'll put it like right here. So on the right-hand side, we have our dynamic contrast, and on the left-hand side, we have nothing. So you can already see there's a little bit of a change here. Let's run down the basics of the sliders and the filter and so forth. We have our normal stuff. We have opacity, we have a few styles, we have a few more in here. Natural is the default, and it does a good job. Surreal is kind of the opposite end of natural, right? That gets really, really, really crispy. And so you need to, there's specialized locations and times for that. But take a look at natural versus surreal and what happens with the sliders, right? The sliders change. So the defaults, this is usually where I'm playing with dynamic contrast, controlling the small, medium, and large texture. And this is based on kind of like the size of the elements that are being adjusted. It's looking at edges, and the small slider will look at small, tiny details. Medium at medium ones and large at large ones. I'm going to zero these all out so we can just see the individual effects of, let's push small, and we're going to see very fine details like in these scratches here. Those are starting to show up, right? And I push that really far. We can see how detailed and nuanced in those rivets. We can see those rivets rising and falling, all the little small details like right down up in here. Return that. Now medium, we'll still see that same contrast pop, but it's a lesser degree. The objects, the deltas, the edges that are being detected, they're more, they're medium-sized things. So like looking around at that rivet again, as I push medium farther, I'm seeing some of that detail, some of that contrast being crispened around the wider edge. But if I bring that down to 0, compare that to small, inside the rivet, like where there's these micro details, that's what small is touching, right? Zero that out. -1, that's going to be good enough. And then large is, kind of the most like nuanced of them as far as looking for objects. Now here we'll see differences primarily in like the very dark tones, like this smudged, blackish, grayish charcoal stuff versus the yellow and gold. We see that accentuation, but not too much else. We're not seeing all those little micro contrasts that we saw with small. Like here, I'm starting to see little small scratches and ridges there. So you can use these sliders in combination to really get exactly the level of detail that you want. I'm going to return to natural. And for a scene like this, natural might be not strong enough because this photo is all about the texture of this door. This thing has just been weathered and it's got dents and welts and all sorts of interesting character. So, this one might be a texture enhancer, and we'll see smalls get really pushed up, but the other ones kind of stay pulled back. As far as the rest of the sliders in this filter, tone, highlight, shadows, I'm not doing too much with these here in this filter. These are all things that are your basic tone coverage. We have those in Develop. We have those in other tools. They're here as conveniences as you adjust contrast. If you realize, oh, it's making the scene, I don't know, a little bit too dark, you can push the shadows up, and just as opposed to having to jump to another tool or add another filter, you've got that that option here. This interesting. This application I just did of this texture enhancer, that points out one interesting thing about dynamic contrast. Something I want to point out is masking. If you notice, this interesting looking mask showed up because that particular style adds a mask. And so getting into practical application, that's one of the first things to look at, is using masks with dynamic contrast. Let me show you an example. This photo here is an HDR blend. HDRs, often we're doing those with very textured, kind of grungy feels. I've actually got two dynamic contrast filters added here. The first one, let me open that up, turn it on. And this is a classic, right? This is just the natural setting. This is the default. It's being applied globally, right? Before that change and after. And just look at all the additional texture and just depth that is being added into, especially around the archway of this. Somewhat in the center. It kind of didn't quite hit the center as much as I wanted. So the beautiful thing about filters, we can add a second one. Adding this one here, before and after, and take a look at the mask, right? We're using a radial mask, so it's one of our masking bugs. Here it is. And this becomes like a spotlight, right? I can just push this around. The shape is edges. I'm masking the look of the filter, I should say. I'm masking the filter away from the edges. And so I have this very tight area where I want this little scene here, this desk and chair and all this kind of stuff, this to have the most texture boost and then fade it out. And I happen just to be using another natural setting. We could play a little bit with surreal and really go kind of hog wild there, and then maybe dial back the opacity some, because HDR photos, sometimes we want to have that extra pop, that extra contrast, those really crisp things coming in here. So surreal, this is kind of where it fits in with really textured things. But even at full strength, even on a textured scene like this, you kind of do have to dial it back a little bit. Let me show you another recipe we can do with dynamic contrast. And this is for a wet pavement or a wet street kind of look, where the streets look really neat after it's rained. There's like some sheen. There's and it's just an extra burst of contrast. Looks really good on cobblestone, but sometimes it just doesn't rain, so you don't get that look. Here is a photo like that. This is like the causeway going up to Castle St. Angelo in Rome. And there's just nice reflections happening in the street lamps coming off this cobblestone way. But wouldn't it have been cool if it had rained and this was really dark and shiny? Well, a general dynamic contrast for the scene overall looks really good. Let me add another one, and this will be for the wet pavement. Now, right now, I'm just going to look at the pavement. I'm going to hit surreal. It's too strong, but I'm just watching the cobblestone, right? I'm watching the cobblestone. That looks pretty darn neat. And now I can mask away, right? We'll open our masking tools. Let's grab a gradient. We'll drop it up here, take it away from the top part, and then we can continue cleaning up with our brush. We can paint out. Maybe I'll paint out at, actually around half strength is good. So I can paint it away from these areas here, just some, right? There. And same thing down this side here. So I want your eyes to be looking at this pretty cool looking cobblestone, and less so on the outside there. But I also want a nice looking fade. We'll view that mask. Missed a little spot there. We'll take care of that. I like to add a little feather on the mask just to smooth out the edges there. Cool. And now we can play with making that street just shine, and look at that extra boost before and after. Probably need to take it away out here a little bit strong. right? But now we've got that nice look where it's like it had rained, things are shiny, and it just adds something extra to the photo. So if you've got one of these scenes where, oh, this would have looked great if it had happened just after a rain, try dynamic contrast, and you can go pretty strong on that surreal setting, play with the opacity, dial it back a little bit, and you get a nice looking wet street type of look. One more recipe for you. This is a great one for your landscapes, especially if you're doing things with water in the scene. You know, waterfalls, seascapes for me, it could be lakes. It really could be anything, but landscapes where you want to have certain parts get crisp and get detail and use that dynamic contrast, and other parts of the scene you want to stay soft. Usually with a landscape, the softer areas are the brighter areas. The sky, the ocean, the lake or the stream or the waterfall, and the darker areas like rocks or grass or the land, you want that to get crisp. And there is a very easy way to do that with dynamic contrast and leveraging a luminosity mask. Now for this one, dynamic contrast overall looks pretty good. It's a little strong for the water, so I'll cut that down to about halfway. But I want more pop on the rocks. I'll add a second one. And here's the recipe, right? Open up your masking area, hit the lumen button, and hit invert. And what that does is it changes the mask. If I view the mask, the rocks become kind of the brighter parts. They become white. This is a mask. And what does the mask mean? Well, the white mask reveals or applies the contrast, and the black or dark mask conceals it. And of course, we can play around with our settings here and dial in exactly what we want. You know, maybe we want to bring that that shadowy area up. We want to cut down what's happening up in the sky there. Change this level here, shifting things so that I'm really targeting toward the rocks. I'll turn off that view. And just so you can see what's going on, if I hit surreal, you'll see those rocks pop, but the rest of the scene is not being affected, right? Before and after. Of course, I'm more of a natural kind of guy, but maybe we'll nudge things up a little farther on the sliders because we're only impacting the darker tones of the photo. So that recipe again is dynamic contrast, luminosity mask, invert the mask. That'll target your dynamic contrast, the darker areas of your scene. It's very often what you want for a landscape scene. And that'll wrap it up for the video. Hope you enjoyed it. There's a lot of different ways you can use dynamic contrast to improve your photos. Leverage the masks, leverage the styles. Don't be shy about pulling back on opacity or adjusting small, medium, and large depending on what your scene needs. Hope you enjoyed it. Got questions? Go ahead and drop them below. And until next time, my name's Scott Davenport. Have fun.